The winter of 1798 in the Kentucky frontier was colder than memory, colder than conscience. In the remote wilderness, where the trees were dark and the wind carried whispers no one dared to follow, a 12-year-old girl vanished, Mercy Harrow. Her disappearance seemed at first like the countless vanishings the frontier had known. Another child swallowed by the woods, another family lost to accident or violence. But Mercy left behind more than absence. She left blood-stained clothing, a diary that chronicled thoughts far beyond her years, confessions that chilled the bones and pried open the mind to truths most historians would rather ignore. The pages spoke of horrors in the raw, the kind that hide behind civilization's fragile mask, and there was evidence. Recent court records buried in stacks of yellowed parchment revealed not a tale of simple tragedy, but a deliberate systemic slaughter along the wilderness trail. Families vanished, dozens of them, under the calculated hand of someone who understood the weaknesses of men, the frailties of trust, and the hunger for survival. Mercy was not only a victim, she was the witness. She saw the machinery of death at work. She saw the smiling faces of neighbors and guides, the masks worn by men who carried knives behind closed hands and intentions darker than the midnight forest. She was 11 when Daniel Crenshaw appeared. Tall, strong, educated, civilized by appearances, but predator by instinct. He was the answer to the Caldwell's prayers, a professional guide promising safety through the wilderness, promising life in a world that devoured innocence. But what Mercy didn't know was that Daniel had been perfecting a system of murder for 3 years. He had learned to turn trust into currency, to exploit kindness, to use knowledge as a blade. The girls like Mercy, the orphans, the intelligent, the vulnerable, these were not obstacles. They were tools. And when he set his gaze on Mercy, it was not affection she felt, but the gravity of a trap being set. She would follow, believing in romance, in salvation, in guidance. But the trail he led was one of shadows, one of death meticulously catalogued in her own handwriting, one that would end not in safety, but in the grim ledger of human horror. Even now, centuries later, the land remembers, the trees remember, the wind carries the echoes of Mercy Harrow, of a girl wed and pregnant at 12, forced into complicity in a nightmare she could barely comprehend. Listen carefully, because what you are about to learn is not folklore. It is a record of cruelty that thrived in plain sight, hidden behind manners, charm, and promises. And if you listen too long, you may begin to understand something most never will. Evil is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it teaches, sometimes it waits for the perfect student. Mercy Harrow arrived on the Kentucky frontier as an orphan, traveling with distant relatives who barely knew her name, barely knew her face, and certainly didn't know the power she carried within her mind. She was 11, small, fragile, yet already sharp beyond her years. Her auburn hair caught the light like fire, and her green eyes carried the quiet intelligence of someone who had been forced to grow up faster than the world allowed. In a place where children were commodities, where survival meant making impossible choices daily, Mercy's mind was her weapon, and the same mind would become her chains. It was Daniel Crenshaw who recognized it first. He saw her learning, her reading, her meticulous attention to detail, and he understood the potential locked in that small, innocent body. To him, she was not a child. She was leverage. He spoke softly, carefully, planting seeds of trust that would grow into obedience. "You are different," he whispered by the firelight, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your intelligence, it is rare. You could be something special." The words were like honey laced with poison. To Mercy, they were comfort, validation in a life stripped of family and stability. She clung to them, she believed them, and in doing so she stepped onto a path from which there would be no return. The frontier was lawless, and the wilderness offered a perfect cover for Crenshaw's machinations. Families traveling westward were easy prey, isolated, trusting, and desperate. The authorities were distant, corruptible, or incompetent. Death and disappearance were explained away as accidents, raids, or misfortune. But Crenshaw was methodical. He did not kill indiscriminately. He planned, he calculated, and he trained Mercy without her knowing, shaping her into a participant in a system that fed on innocence. She recorded weather patterns, kept notes on families' possessions, and catalogued their movements. To her, it was education, responsibility, preparation for frontier life. To him it was intelligence gathering, reconnaissance for profit and murder. The first months passed like a dream for Mercy, a dangerous dream that blurred the line between affection and control. Crenshaw was attentive, protective, almost tender, and she, desperate for security, leaned into the illusion. She did not see the sharp edge beneath the comfort. The charm, the kindness, the books and lessons, these were tools of manipulation. Every smile was a leash, every compliment a shackle. By the time she realized the depths of the danger surrounding her, the trap was nearly complete. Her future had been written in the shadows, and she was an unwitting scribe. The wilderness waited silently around their cabin. The trees, the cold winds, the isolation, they were all witnesses to the construction of a nightmare, and Mercy, too young to resist, but too intelligent to remain blind, began to sense the cracks in Crenshaw's carefully painted reality. Yet her curiosity, her desire to please, and her need for belonging kept her silent. She was learning the rules of a game she had never wanted to play, and the cost of losing would be measured in blood. The autumn of 1797 had barely set its first frost when Mercy Harrow found herself wed. A child, barely 12, married not in the warmth of family or love, but in the careful orchestration of Daniel Crenshaw, the man who had taught her to trust him, and then slowly twisted that trust into something darker. The ceremony was crude, brief, performed by a wandering preacher whose name was almost certainly fabricated. The Caldwells, grateful to have Mercy's future settled, offered what little they had: supplies, food, a blessing. They did not understand that in doing so, they had funded the beginning of a monstrous enterprise. Mercy clasped Crenshaw's hand, trembling, believing in the promises he whispered into her ear: adventure, purpose, protection. She could not yet comprehend the machinery of death being set in motion around her. Their cabin was tucked deep in a secluded valley, 15 miles from the main wilderness trail, shielded by jagged rocks and towering oaks. Here, Daniel explained, they could operate freely, close enough to intercept travelers in need of guidance, but hidden from prying eyes. Mercy threw herself into her new life, meticulously recording weather, animal movements, and safe passages. She believed she was building a life of purpose, a partnership in a noble endeavor. And in some ways she was. But purpose and poison had become inseparable. The information she compiled, her careful handwriting, her observations, her precision, would later serve as the blueprint for the slaughter of unsuspecting families. She was learning to document, not for knowledge, but for control. At night, Crenshaw read to her from books he claimed to have carried from his life in Philadelphia: Shakespeare, the Bible, philosophical texts, gifts to a mind starving for education. And yet, each lesson came with a subtle conditioning, a mental tether. He praised her intelligence, spoke of her uniqueness, drew her into a world where obedience became a virtue and doubt a dangerous spark. Mercy began to internalize these lessons without realizing that she was being trained to normalize complicity. Her world narrowed to the cabin, the forest, the man she trusted, and the unseen network of death he was weaving beyond the trees. By December, she was pregnant, a child herself, yet still in the thrall of Crenshaw's manipulations. He attended to her, soothing the morning sickness, tending her feet, masking control with care. But the first cracks began to appear. He traveled alone for days, acquiring supplies without explanation. His stories of merchants bartering or chance encounters never quite aligned. Something about the precision of his absences unsettled her, though she could not yet name it. And the arrival of the first family, the Harmons, crystallized a hidden fear she had only felt in whispers. Watching from her window, she observed Daniel asking questions that seemed innocent, but were loaded, probing for details no traveler would willingly share. It was reconnaissance masquerading as conversation, and Mercy could see the glint of calculation in his eyes. Even then, she was too trusting, too young, too enmeshed in the illusion of partnership to act. But the unease had taken root. The gentle facade of her husband was beginning to fracture, revealing glimpses of the man who understood power, control, and the vulnerability of innocence. The frontier, with all its dangers, was not what threatened her. It was the man she had believed would guide her through it. Spring arrived slowly, melting the last snow from the high passes, and with it came the first signs that Mercy's life was no longer her own. The first family, the Harmons, had come and gone, leaving Mercy with a cold certainty she could not yet name. Daniel had guided them through safely, as promised, but the questions he asked lingered like shadows over her mind. How much money they carried, their planned routes, the timing of letters to relatives, all catalogued in her notebooks, her observations turning from innocent record-keeping to intelligence gathering for something far darker. The Harmons were fortunate, Daniel explained later, but they were only the beginning. He had a system now, and she, unwittingly, had become its assistant. When the Pritchards arrived, wealthy merchants from Richmond with wagons brimming with goods, the full machinery of Daniel's operation revealed itself. Mercy watched from the cabin, hidden under the pretense of illness. She saw him question them with precision, almost clinical in nature, probing for weaknesses, gauging trust, calculating wealth, cataloguing the information that would determine life or death. His voice, once gentle in her ears, now carried an edge that froze her young heart. He spoke of business, opportunity, and protection, but his eyes betrayed the cold calculus behind his words. Mercy began to sense it, danger that was not random, but deliberate, planned, inevitable. Her notebooks became compasses for death. The weather patterns she charted, the clearings she mapped, even the details of the families themselves, all were now part of an operation she could barely understand. She began to notice patterns, small but terrifying. Families who trusted him disappeared, their possessions vanished, and Crenshaw returned with gifts he could never explain. Her instincts whispered alarm, but the spell he had cast over her, through Furon, flattery, attention, and the illusion of protection, kept her compliant. She had no family to warn her, no one to tell her the truth. She was alone, surrounded by wilderness and a man who had trained her to obey. And yet, even in fear, a flicker of resistance burned within her. She began to write differently in her diary, noting anomalies, inconsistencies, the moments that set her nerves on edge. Her words were careful, coded for herself, documenting horror before fully recognizing its shape. Mercy had become a witness, not just to death, but to the architecture of evil. Every night she lay awake listening to Daniel's movements outside, his whispered calculations, the soft rustle of supplies being arranged, and felt a creeping certainty. The man she married was not a protector, he was a predator, and she was trapped inside his meticulously designed world. The wilderness outside remained indifferent, a silent accomplice to the horrors unfolding within. Trees swayed, rivers ran, and animals hunted, all oblivious to the human cruelty shaping the valleys. And Mercy, only 12, pregnant, intelligent beyond her years, began the slow, agonizing process of understanding the truth. Safety was an illusion. Trust was a weapon. And her role in the unfolding nightmare was both unwilling and indispensable. By late April, the pattern had become undeniable. Families arrived under Daniel Crenshaw's guidance, trusting his expertise, and Mercy, watching from the shadows, began to see the orchestration of something monstrous. The Pritchards had been meticulous in revealing their wealth, their possessions, the locations of hidden valuables, and Daniel catalogued it all. He moved with precision, examining wagons, questioning intentions, and planning with the cold certainty of someone who had done this before. Mercy's heart raced as she recognized the signs. This was no ordinary frontier guide. This was a system, a machine designed for extraction, manipulation, and death, and she, through her diligence and education, had become an essential part of it. Her pregnancy, a source of pride and a mark of her maturity, became also her shield. Daniel insisted she remain inside the cabin, claiming delicacy and propriety, but the truth was far darker. Her isolation allowed him to operate without witnesses, to groom her for obedience, and to condition her to the rhythm of control. She recorded details she could not yet comprehend: the layout of wagons, the supplies carried, the family's routines. And these notes, so innocent in her eyes, were the blueprints for calculating profit and survival, for choosing targets, for disposing of those who might resist. Yet the awareness gnawed at her. Mercy began noticing inconsistencies in his stories, small discrepancies he could not mask. Where had he obtained flour, sugar, luxuries? Why did his excursions last days, with no explanation for his absences? The wilderness, once a playground of curiosity and wonder, now pressed upon her with menace. Every shadow seemed to move with intent, every sound a warning. And as she observed, the veil began to lift. She was no longer merely a participant in the adventure he promised. She was complicit in the machinery of predation. Mercy's education, once a source of hope and pride, became a tool of survival and terror. She learned to record, to notice, to calculate, to obey, because failure to do so might expose her to danger. And yet, even as fear took root, there remained a spark of resistance. She wrote in secret, documenting anomalies, strange behaviors, the moments that set her teeth on edge. Her diary became a silent witness, the only companion in a cabin filled with control, manipulation, and the quiet, suffocating terror of a young girl trapped in a man's meticulously designed world. By the time the Pritchards left, Mercy understood the stakes. Obedience was not optional. Compliance was survival, and knowledge, her knowledge, was both a gift and a curse. Daniel had trained her to see without seeing, to record without understanding, to participate without questioning. And yet, beneath the layers of fear, a seed of awakening began to grow. She was beginning to understand the structure of his system, the way he preyed on trust, the way he turned innocence into power for himself. And the deeper she understood, the more she realized there was no turning back from this path. The second family's arrival cemented the terror Mercy had only begun to sense. The Pritchards were careful, wealthy, and confident, exactly the type of targets Daniel sought. From her hiding place, Mercy watched him move among them like a predator, attentive, smiling, asking questions that seemed innocent but were laced with calculation. He inquired about the family's finances, their planned destinations, the contacts they had awaiting them, and even probed for information about letters sent back east. Every answer he collected, every detail he memorized or recorded, was a piece of the blueprint that would determine whether these people survived or vanished into the wilderness forever. Mercy felt a chill that night she couldn't shake. She had unknowingly become an instrument in a system that measured human life against profit and opportunity. At 12, pregnant and forced into complicity, Mercy's perception of Daniel had shifted. The gentle, educated man who had courted her with books and attention now revealed a merciless side. He commanded her obedience without question, his tone sharp, cold, and unyielding. "Your job is to trust me and follow instructions exactly," he said, and she did, because disobedience could mean more than punishment. It could mean death for the families and for herself. Each day she watched him act, she saw the precision of his planning, the careful assessment of wealth, the timing of arrivals, the selection of vulnerable moments. It was terrifying, methodical, and disturbingly effective. Even as the operation expanded, Mercy's diary became a refuge. She wrote, not just for herself, but as a silent record of what she witnessed. She described the questions, the mannerisms, the quiet attentiveness that masked predation. She began to see patterns, the families who left intact, the families who vanished. The wilderness itself seemed complicit. She turned once, ailing evidence, swallowing screams, leaving only her observations as proof. The isolation of their cabin, the remoteness of the valley, and the trust she had been taught to place in Daniel combined to create a perfect environment for murder under the guise of guidance. Mercy's awakening was gradual but inevitable. She began to understand the system for what it truly was, a machine of control and death. Her education, her intelligence, the very gifts that had made her special, had been weaponized against others and, in subtle ways, against herself. Daniel's manipulations were precise, psychological, and terrifyingly effective. He had turned charm into leverage, instruction into conditioning, and affection into a leash. And Mercy, trapped in the dual role of child and accomplice, felt the weight of complicity settle onto her shoulders, even as fear and fascination wrestled within her. By the time the Pritchards departed, Mercy knew the truth. This was no ordinary frontier life. The wilderness had become a hunting ground, Daniel the orchestrator, and she, despite herself, an essential part of the machine. There would be no escape, no innocence left untouched. And somewhere deep in her heart, a flicker of defiance began, a spark she would need if she hoped to survive, to witness, and perhaps to record the darkness for the world to one day understand. Mercy's days became a careful dance between obedience and observation. She moved quietly through the cabin, pretending illness when necessary, recording meticulously the arrivals, possessions, and behaviors of the families that came seeking Daniel's guidance. Each note in her diary became a silent testament to the duality of her existence, outwardly compliant, inwardly horrified. She began noticing subtleties, the way Daniel's gaze lingered on valuables, how he measured reactions, the slight changes in tone when certain questions were answered. Every detail mattered, and she catalogued it all, even as her young mind struggled to reconcile love, fear, and the creeping understanding of the horrors unfolding around her. The operation was growing, and with it, the complexity of Daniel's methods. He no longer relied solely on charm or feigned innocence. Now, he tested families, observed their vulnerabilities, and gauged their reactions to pressure, using Mercy's detailed records to plan each move. She saw the transformation in his interactions. Warmth masked calculation, attention concealed predation. She realized slowly that he had trained her not just to record, but to perceive the elements that made a family valuable or expendable. Her education, once a source of pride, had become a tool of survival and a mechanism for control. Evenings were the worst. Mercy would sit by the small fire, watching Daniel prepare supplies, arrange goods, and revise his strategies. Her own notes had become part of the system, the silent engine behind his efficiency. She could see how he anticipated the movements of families, how he calculated the perfect timing for departures, how he selected targets not by chance, but by careful evaluation. And yet, he still spoke to her with a tenderness that had once felt protective, blurring the line between mentorship and manipulation. The juxtaposition of care and control was dizzying. It forced her to question everything she felt, everything she trusted. And then there was the physical toll. At 12, with a child growing inside her, the responsibilities of obedience, observation, and documentation pressed heavily upon her. Her body was vulnerable, her mind alert, and every day she became more aware of how power and danger intertwined. Daniel controlled not just her movements but her perceptions, teaching her to measure worth, calculate risk, and suppress alarm. Mercy began to see the wilderness not as a playground, but as a partner in Daniel's design, an indifferent accomplice to his predations, swallowing evidence, hiding traces, and amplifying his influence. In those quiet, tense hours, a strange awareness began to take root. Mercy realized that knowledge itself had power and danger. Every observation, every recorded detail, was a double-edged sword. It could protect her, it could endanger her, and it could reveal truths that the world was not ready to see. She was a witness, a participant, and perhaps the only one capable of understanding the full scope of the darkness. And in that realization, fear became clarity. The frontier was not merely wild, it was controlled, and she was trapped inside the mind of a man who understood every lever, every vulnerability, and every secret that could be exploited. By mid-spring, Mercy had begun to see the full shape of the horror surrounding her. The patterns were undeniable. Families came, guided by Daniel, and the wilderness seemed to swallow them whole, leaving only traces for her to observe. She began to understand the logic behind it all. Daniel selected his targets carefully, analyzing wealth, vulnerability, and isolation. Every family was weighed, measured, and assigned a place in his grim calculus, and Mercy, through her notes and observations, had become an essential component of the system. Her intelligence, once a gift, was now a tool enabling the machinery of death. The Pritchards had shown her just how precise Daniel could be. She saw how he asked questions under the guise of guidance, probing for financial details, family connections, and intentions beyond the journey. He listened for hesitation, observed for discomfort, and recorded it all in ways Mercy could only partially comprehend. Each answer, each gesture, each seemingly innocuous piece of information contributed to the selection process, the invisible mechanism that decided who would survive and who would vanish. Mercy had begun to grasp that this was not random cruelty. It was deliberate, systemic, and horrifyingly effective. At night, the weight of her awareness pressed down on her chest. She knew she was trapped, both physically and psychologically. Daniel's control was total. He had trained her to obey, to record, to perceive without question. Yet she could not unsee what she witnessed. She had begun to notice inconsistencies, subtle manipulations, and the cold precision behind every action he took. The love and attention he showed her were calculated, designed to secure loyalty, silence doubt, and ensure compliance. Every kind word, every smile, every act of apparent protection was a tether, anchoring her to a reality she could neither escape nor fully confront. Her pregnancy added another layer of vulnerability. At 12, she was still a child, and yet she carried life within her. Daniel's attentions, once charming, now felt like a complex trap, a way to reinforce dependence and ensure that she could not resist. She began to record not only the movements of the families, but the subtle patterns of his behavior, the disappearances, the timing, the way he leveraged trust into control. Her diary became both a weapon and a prison, a silent witness to crimes she could neither stop nor fully understand. And in the quiet, Mercy realized a terrible truth. Knowledge had become a curse. Her intelligence, her education, and her acute awareness were no longer sources of power. They were instruments of manipulation, tools in a system of control she was powerless to dismantle. She was awake in a world of sleepwalkers, a single mind capable of perceiving the architecture of evil. And with that awakening came the knowledge that there was no turning back. Every observation she made, every detail she recorded pulled her deeper into the machine, tightening the web around her until escape would be almost unthinkable. The killings were no longer invisible to Mercy. What had once been hidden in Daniel's disappearances and vague explanations now pressed against the thin walls of her world. She heard the muffled cries at night, the sudden silences in the woods, the return of Daniel's boots stained with mud, and sometimes something darker. He never explained, never confessed, and yet the evidence was everywhere. The families who arrived with laughter and trust left in fragments, if they left at all. Mercy, with her sharp eyes and her unwilling role, was beginning to see the structure of his cruelty as clearly as the ink on her diary pages. She realized that Daniel's system thrived on invisibility. The wilderness was both weapon and accomplice. When a family vanished, the frontier swallowed them whole. No lawman rode out to investigate, no neighbor came to ask questions. The valley was too far, too wild, too forgotten, and that silence gave Daniel his power. He chose when to strike, how to erase, and how to ensure no trail remained. Mercy, trapped inside his orbit, saw the pattern. Every disappearance was perfectly timed, every loss hidden by distance, every life measured against profit and control. For Mercy, the guilt came quietly, settling into her like a sickness. She recorded details, and those details became the framework of murder. She had mapped the wagons, listed the valuables, even noted family dynamics, all under Daniel's direction, believing it was practice or duty or preparation for their own survival. Only now did she understand. Her notes were instructions, her intelligence a tool sharpened for death. She was both victim and participant, bound to a crime that grew larger each day. The weight of this knowledge made her body feel heavier, especially with the child growing inside her. She was no longer just a girl observing horrors. She was a mother, however young, carrying life into a world already poisoned with death. Every kick, every stirring within her reminded her that she had to endure, had to survive, and perhaps had to record for a reason she did not yet fully understand. Her diary became her secret prayer, her only rebellion. If the world ever uncovered it, the truth would not be buried with her. Daniel remained unchanged. To him, each killing was efficiency, each disappearance a necessity, each family a resource to be harvested. He moved with calm certainty, untroubled, as though he were not merely a man in the wilderness but something larger, an architect of fate, the hand that decided who lived and who vanished. And Mercy, staring at him across the firelight, understood the terrible reality. He had made her a part of that architecture. The line between her survival and her complicity was gone. Mercy's mind began to fracture under the weight of what she carried. Sleep no longer came easily. When she closed her eyes, she saw faces, the children who had smiled at her, the mothers who had trusted her, the fathers who had shaken Daniel's hand. She heard voices that had once filled the cabin with laughter, only to fade into silence, devoured by the woods. The line between memory and nightmare blurred, and Mercy began waking in the night with her fists clenched, her throat raw from screams she had swallowed. Daniel noticed, of course. He always noticed. He spoke to her gently as though calming a frightened animal. "You think too much," he would whisper, brushing her hair from her face. "The world is harsh. I keep us safe. One day, you'll understand." His tone was soothing, his words delivered like scripture, but beneath them was the command: obey, accept, remain silent. And Mercy, exhausted and bound by fear, nodded. But inside, something twisted tighter, a knot of grief and rage that no tenderness could untangle. Her diary became more dangerous with each entry. What had begun as lists and details now turned into confession. She wrote in fragments, lines torn between fact and feeling. "They are gone. I saw the blood." He smiled after. "I am not blind." She pressed the words deep into the paper as though carving them into stone, knowing that if Daniel ever read them, it could mean her death. The diary was her only voice, and it grew darker with every page. The strain showed in her body as well. The pregnancy weakened her, made her fragile in a place where fragility was peril. Some mornings she could barely stand, her stomach heavy, her back aching, her heart pounding with fear. Yet Daniel demanded her mind remain sharp. "I need you," he would say, handing her tasks, instructing her to observe, to record, to notice what others could not. She was both essential and expendable, cherished and imprisoned. That paradox cut into her with every passing day. And so Mercy lived between two truths: outward obedience, inward collapse. She smiled when Daniel demanded it, performed her duties when ordered, and walked among families with the practiced innocence of a child. But in the quiet moments, when her hand pressed against the swelling of her belly or hovered over the pages of her diary, she felt the enormity of the trap. She was 12 years old, carrying a child, documenting death, and chained to a man who had turned her very existence into an instrument of control. It was in this crucible of silence and horror that Mercy began to imagine a third possibility: survival not only of the body, but of the truth. If she could not escape, if she could not stop him, then perhaps she could endure long enough to ensure that the world would one day know. It was the smallest spark of hope, almost invisible against the darkness. But for Mercy, it was the only thing left to keep her from breaking completely. The first act of defiance was so small it could have gone unnoticed, but for Mercy, it was a fracture in the wall Daniel had built around her. It happened one morning as Daniel instructed her to record the belongings of a newly arrived family. They were kind, exhausted travelers with children not much younger than Mercy. The father offered her a piece of dried fruit, smiling at her with a warmth she had nearly forgotten existed. She hesitated, then took it, the sweetness lingering on her tongue like a forbidden memory. Later, when Daniel pressed her for details, Mercy faltered. She listed their possessions, their animals, their supplies, but she deliberately omitted one item, a silver locket the mother wore, glinting softly against her chest. Mercy had noticed it instantly, its delicate engravings too fine to belong in the wilderness. She knew Daniel would covet it, perhaps even fixate on it, and so for the first time, she withheld the truth. The omission burned in her chest, a secret rebellion. Daniel studied her notes, nodding, satisfied. He did not notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. Mercy kept her face still, her voice steady, but inside her heart raced. She had lied, not openly, not brazenly, but enough to know she could, enough to feel a flicker of control in a life otherwise ruled by his hand. That night she wrote it down in her diary. I kept something from him. He does not know. I am not only his eyes. The words shook as she carved them onto the page. For the first time she felt like her diary was not just a record of his crimes, but a ledger of her resistance, a hidden testament that she was more than a tool. Yet defiance brought new fear. What if he discovered the omission? What if he sensed the shift in her? Daniel's ability to read her was uncanny, as if he could see inside her thoughts. She had to move carefully, with precision equal to his own. Any mistake, any crack in her mask could bring punishment, swift and merciless. Still, the act changed her. Mercy began to realize that obedience was not absolute, that silence could be a weapon, that even in captivity, even in the shadow of a man who orchestrated death, she had choices, small ones, fragile ones, but choices nonetheless. And with those choices came the faint outline of a path, a way to endure without surrendering entirely to his design. The rebellion was invisible to Daniel, but to Mercy it was everything. For the first time she felt the stirrings of a will that was her own. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. At first it was subtle, a lingering glance at her notes, a pause when she handed him a list, the way his eyes narrowed as though he could see what wasn't written. He said nothing, but his silence was heavier than words. Mercy felt it pressing on her whenever he looked at her, like a weight designed to crush her into confession. One evening by the fire, he asked her to recite back everything she'd observed that day. His tone was gentle, but the request was a test. Mercy's throat tightened as she repeated details, carefully matching the lists she had given him. She dared not falter, dared not reveal the secret she had kept. When she finished, Daniel studied her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled faintly and said, "You're sharper than most grown men. That's why I trust you." The words should have comforted her, but they made her stomach turn. Trust in Daniel's mouth was not safety. It was surveillance, a constant reminder that he owned her mind as much as her body, and Mercy began to suspect that he wasn't fooled at all, that he had sensed the omission but chose not to expose her. Perhaps he wanted to see how far she would go. Perhaps the game itself amused him. From then on, his behavior shifted. He became more attentive, more probing. He asked her to watch families with a sharper eye, to note not only possessions but emotions, fears, hidden weaknesses. He pressed her for opinions, testing her judgment, weaving her deeper into his designs. And all the while, his questions carried an undercurrent, as though he were measuring her loyalty as carefully as he measured his victims. For Mercy, the pressure was unbearable. She could feel the walls closing in, the space for rebellion shrinking, but the very act of resistance, small as it had been, had awakened something in her. She could not unlearn the fact that Neil's control was not absolute, and that knowledge gave her both strength and terror. At night, with her hand resting on her belly and her diary hidden beneath her pallet, she whispered silently to the life inside her, "I will not let him own all of me. I will not let him take everything." It was a vow, fragile and dangerous, but it was hers. And perhaps, just perhaps, Daniel knew it. His eyes lingered too long, his smiles cut too sharp, his silences stretched too wide. He was watching her more closely now, as though he could sense the faintest shift in the balance between them. The hunter had felt the tremor of prey that no longer moved exactly as expected. The test came without warning. A new family had arrived, a small group of settlers with little to their name, weary from the trail, grateful for Daniel's offer of shelter. Mercy watched them with quiet intensity. The children reminded her of herself, their eyes wide with both fear and wonder. The mother clutched a worn book of scripture, the father a rusted rifle that seemed more symbolic than useful. They were fragile, hopeful, easy prey. Daniel waited until nightfall. When the family slept in the lean-to by the edge of the clearing, he called Mercy outside. The firelight flickered across his face, sharpening the shadows, making him look more spectre than man. He handed her a small pouch of coins taken from another traveler and said, "Count them." She obeyed, her fingers trembling. When she finished, he leaned closer. "Tell me, Mercy," he said softly. "What do they have that's worth more than these?" It was a trap. She knew it instantly. He wasn't asking about possessions. He was asking her to betray herself, to show whether she had absorbed his way of seeing the world, whether she could strip humanity down to profit, weakness, and gain. Her heart pounded. She wanted to say nothing, to remain silent, but Daniel's eyes pinned her in place, waiting. "They have children," she whispered finally. He smiled. "Good. You see it now. Children make people careless. They'll trade anything to keep them alive." Her stomach turned, but she kept her face still. The truth was, she had answered only to survive. She hadn't meant it as he took it. But in that moment, Daniel marked her as his pupil, his confidant, his heir to cruelty. And Mercy realized that her resistance had only made him tighten the leash. That night she wrote furiously in her diary, her words jagged and desperate. "He wants me to think like him. He wants me to become him. I cannot, I will not. But if I pretend, maybe I live long enough to outlast him." The test had revealed something Mercy dreaded. Daniel did not simply want her obedience. He wanted her transformation. And for the first time, she wondered if survival meant not only protecting her life and her child, but protecting her soul from being reshaped into his image. The next test came days later, and this time Mercy chose to risk everything. Daniel had been circling the new family like a wolf, watching for weakness. One morning, he asked Mercy to sit with the mother while he busied himself with the father. "Notice her," he told her, "and tell me what she clings to most, what she'll trade, what she'll hide." His words carried the same undertone as always: "Prove your worth." Mercy sat quietly beside the woman as she rocked her youngest child to sleep. The woman hummed an old hymn, soft and trembling, while her hand absently brushed the locket at her neck, the same one Mercy had kept hidden from Daniel before. The sight of it struck her like a knife. She knew this was what Daniel wanted her to report. One word from her lips, and that small, fragile treasure would vanish into his pocket, another victory in his endless game of control. But Mercy stayed silent. When Daniel asked her later what she had seen, she lowered her eyes and whispered, "The book, the way she holds it. She won't let it out of her hands." For a long, tense moment, Daniel just looked at her. His silence stretched so sharp that Mercy thought her heart might give out from the pounding. She couldn't read his expression. Did he believe her, or had he caught the lie? Then, suddenly he laughed, not with warmth but with a kind of cold amusement. "The book," he said, nodding. "Of course. Scripture makes people foolish. They'll starve clinging to faith before they give up a single page." He seemed pleased with her answer, convinced it was true. Mercy forced a small smile, but inside her body shook with the enormity of what she had done. For the first time, she had lied to Daniel's face. Not an omission, not a subtle misdirection, but a direct fabrication. And he had believed her, or at least he had chosen to. That night she pressed her diary to her chest before writing, "He trusts me more than he should. He does not see all. I can choose what he knows. I can bend the truth. If I am careful, I can save pieces of them and pieces of myself." The lie was dangerous. If Daniel ever uncovered it, punishment would be certain, but it was also liberating. Mercy had proven to herself that she could deceive him, even under his gaze, even in the shadow of his power, and that small act of rebellion carried more strength than any weapon she could hold. For the first time, Mercy didn't just feel like a prisoner. She felt like a player in the same game Daniel thought only he controlled. The consequences came sooner than Mercy expected. One evening, Daniel returned from scouting with a dark mood in his eyes. He had seen movement on the ridge, a lone man, possibly a trader, perhaps a scout for another group. "We'll see if he has anything worth taking," Daniel muttered. "You'll come with me." They tracked the stranger until dusk and caught him gathering wood near a small fire. He wasn't armed beyond a hunting knife, his clothes ragged, his face hollow from hunger. Daniel interrogated him with that peculiar calm he carried, questions sharp and probing. The man answered quickly, nervously. He claimed to have nothing of value, just a few tools and dried meat, but Mercy, watching closely, noticed something Daniel did not. The man's eyes flicked toward a leather pouch tucked under his bedroll. Daniel turned to her. "Well, you see anything?" Her heart stopped. She knew the truth. That pouch was hidden on purpose, and Daniel would tear it from him the moment she revealed it. She also knew the man's fate might hinge on her answer. If Daniel found anything worth keeping, the man would never leave that ridge alive. Mercy swallowed hard. "Nothing," she whispered. "He has nothing." Daniel studied her, silent, weighing her words. Then he turned back to the man, scanning the bedroll himself. For a moment, Mercy thought the lie would unravel, but then Daniel straightened, eyes narrowing. "She's right. A worthless stray." He waved his hand dismissively. "Go, before I change my mind." The man fled, vanishing into the tree line with his life and his secret intact. Mercy's pulse thundered in her ears. She had done it. She had saved him. But the victory was poisoned with dread. For if Daniel ever discovered the truth, if the man spoke of the pouch to someone else, if word spread, Mercy would be the one to pay. She had not just lied to protect a trinket, she had lied to save a life. That night she wrote in her diary with a trembling hand, "I changed the story. Because of me, he lives. Daniel will never know. He cannot know." And yet even as she pressed the words onto the page, she felt the danger closing in. Daniel's trust in her was growing, but so was his scrutiny. Every lie made the line thinner, the stakes higher, and Mercy realized that she was no longer just surviving Daniel, she was fighting him in silence, in shadows, one decision at a time. Suspicion was a scent Daniel could follow like a hound. At first he said nothing, but Mercy noticed small shifts. He repeated questions more often, circling back to details she thought he had forgotten. He asked her to retell the same observation twice, hours apart, comparing her words for cracks. Sometimes he'd stare at her diary, as though he could read the pages through the cover. Then came the moment that chilled her. Daniel set a knife on the table between them and asked her to describe the new settlers who had passed through the clearing 2 days before. Mercy recited what she remembered, careful, measured. Daniel leaned back, silent. Then he asked again, word for word, as if he hadn't heard her. Her pulse spiked. She knew what this was. It wasn't information he wanted, it was consistency. He was testing whether her memory aligned with what she had already told him. Mercy repeated her account, fighting to keep her voice steady. When she finished, Daniel smiled faintly. "Good. No slips." He tapped the knife once against the wood, then slid it back into his belt. Mercy forced herself to breathe evenly, but inside, terror gnawed at her. He was watching her more closely than ever, probing for weakness, waiting for the moment she revealed herself. Her lies had spared lives, yes, but they had also put her under a sharper lens. That night she wrote, "He knows something. Not what, but something. I feel it in the way he looks at me. I cannot falter. If I do, the cost will not be mine alone. It will fall on the innocent too." Daniel's suspicion was no longer a shadow. It was a blade hanging above her, swaying on a thin thread. And Mercy understood that every choice she made now was not just survival. It was war, waged quietly, with lies and silence as her only weapons. The trap came disguised as chance. Daniel returned one evening with a satchel slung over his shoulder, its leather still dusted with trail dirt. He tossed it onto the table and let its contents spill out, jerked meat, a rusted compass, and a folded scrap of cloth stained with old blood. "Found it by the creek," he said casually. "Might have belonged to that stray we let go." Mercy's heart seized. The pouch. She recognized the stitching, the worn edges. It was the same one the starving man had hidden under his bedroll. Daniel hadn't let him go empty-handed after all. He had followed, taken it and brought it back here, waiting to see what she would do. Strange, isn't it? Daniel's voice was smooth, almost playful. You swore he had nothing, but look here. He had something all along. The room was suffocatingly silent. Mercy forced herself to meet his eyes, though every instinct screamed to look away. I didn't see it, she said softly, steady as she could. I told you what I knew. Daniel tilted his head, studying her like one studies a caged animal, measuring how much it can endure before it breaks. Then he leaned closer, his whisper colder than any shout. Lies rot, Mercy, and rot spreads. For a long moment she thought the knife would come out again, but instead he laughed, low and bitter, and swept the pouch back into his satchel. Perhaps you were blind, perhaps you weren't. Either way, remember this. If you ever think to outwit me, make sure you're clever enough to survive the consequences. That night, Mercy wrote with a trembling hand. He knows. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough to doubt me. He is watching, waiting. I walk on ice so thin I can hear it cracking beneath me. But beneath her fear was something else, a spark she couldn't extinguish. If Daniel suspected her lies, it meant her lies mattered. They had power, and that meant his power was not absolute. Daniel did not wait long to tighten the noose. 2 nights later, he summoned Mercy and the settler family to the fire. The flames painted everything in cruel light, faces hollow, shadows deep. Daniel held up the blood-stained pouch as if it were a sacred object, then set it on the ground between them. This, he said, was hidden. Not by me, not by chance. Someone here thought they could keep secrets. His gaze slid from the mother to the father, then finally to Mercy. He let the silence stretch until it pressed on every chest like a weight. The father stammered, insisting he had never seen the pouch before. The mother clutched her children tighter, eyes darting between Daniel and Mercy, as if searching for rescue. Mercy's throat tightened. She knew exactly what this was. Daniel wasn't after truth. He was after loyalty. Finally, Daniel turned to her. You're clever, he said softly. You see what others miss. Tell me, Mercy, was it them or was it you? The trap was perfect. If she pointed to the family, Daniel would destroy them. If she admitted it was her, she would expose herself and likely meet the same fate. Her only tools were silence and invention, and Daniel had already shown he could slice silence apart with suspicion. Mercy drew in a slow breath. It wasn't me, she said carefully, and it wasn't them. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Then who? Mercy's voice was steady, though her insides shook. A traveler before them. Someone already gone. That pouch was left behind long before these people came. The words hung in the night like smoke. For a moment, Daniel just stared, searching her face for cracks. Then, slowly, he leaned back, the firelight catching the faintest curl of a smile. Perhaps, he murmured. He rose, slid the pouch back into his satchel, and walked into the darkness without another word. The family exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for hours. But Mercy didn't relax. She knew what had just happened. Daniel hadn't believed her. Not really. He had only let the lie stand. For now. Her diary entry that night was short, written in a trembling hand. Every word is a blade. Every silence is a gamble. Tonight I chose the lie. Tomorrow he may not let it pass. The punishment came without warning. At dawn, Daniel called everyone outside. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of morning where sound carries far. He stood before them, his satchel slung over his shoulder, the blood-stained pouch dangling from his hand. I've thought on it, he said. Secrets fester when left unchecked, and secrets have a price. His eyes drifted, not to Mercy as she expected, but to the father of the family. Before anyone could protest, Daniel struck him across the face with the back of his hand, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The mother screamed, the children cried out. Daniel silenced them with a glare that froze the air. This one, Daniel said, pressing his boot to the father's chest, "will serve as reminder. If anyone hides from me again, if anyone thinks they can deceive me, I will not be so merciful." He ground his heel until the man gasped in pain, then kicked him aside like a rag doll. Mercy stood rigid, her insides churning. She knew what this was, not justice, not even suspicion. It was theater. Daniel was punishing the father to send a message to her, a warning written in bruises and blood. She wanted to cry out, to beg him to stop, but she didn't. She held her silence, hands trembling at her sides. Her defiance had bought the family time, but now the cost was etched into their skin. That night, her diary shook with anger. He knew. He struck him to strike me. Every lie I tell, every truth I protect, he will carve the payment into someone else. My war with him is not hidden anymore. It has begun. And yet, beneath the terror, something darker grew in Mercy, a seed of resolve. If Daniel meant to make her feel the weight of her defiance, then he had also made one thing clear. His power could bleed. And if it could bleed, it could break. That night, Mercy could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the father's face bruised and bloodied, the mother's silent sobs, the children's wide, broken stares. And above it all, Daniel's calm voice, measured, deliberate, unshaken. She realized then that surviving him would never be enough. If she did nothing, he would go on carving his lessons into the weak, using fear as his scripture. So Mercy began to plan. Not in grand gestures, not yet. Her rebellion took the shape of whispers in her diary, of small calculations in the quiet hours. She catalogued his habits, the times he slept, the places he hid his tools, the way his eyes lingered on certain trails. She noticed what made him careless, his arrogance, his belief that fear alone kept people obedient. And she began to think of allies. The family feared her almost as much as they feared him, but Mercy caught the mother's gaze one night across the fire. It lingered for a second too long, a flicker of silent understanding. The children too had started to look at Mercy differently, not as Daniel's scribe, but as something else, someone who might stand between them and his wrath. Mercy's diary entry that night was not written with fear, but with purpose. I will not only lie to him, I will undo him, piece by piece, shadow by shadow. One day, his fire will burn out, and I will be the one to snuff it. For the first time since her captivity began, Mercy did not feel only terror. She felt something new, dangerous, fragile, but undeniable. Hope. The first act was almost invisible. It began with food. Daniel rationed every scrap with precision, doling it out like a priest handing communion. Bread for the children, meat for himself, crumbs for the rest. Hunger was one of his tools, as sharp as his knife. One evening, while Daniel scouted the tree line, Mercy slipped a sliver of dried venison from his satchel, just enough for the children to eat without notice. She broke it in her hands and pressed the pieces into their palms with a finger to her lips. The children's eyes widened. They chewed quickly, silently, as if the act itself might conjure Daniel's wrath. The mother gave Mercy a look, half gratitude, half terror. Mercy only nodded. When Daniel returned, he counted his stores. He frowned, muttered, then shrugged it off as his own miscalculation. But Mercy saw something shift in the firelight. For the first time, doubt flickered, not in him, but in the family. They had tasted food, not from Daniel's hand, and once someone tastes freedom, no matter how small, obedience is never as absolute. That night, Mercy's diary read, "A crumb is enough to weaken chains. I stole nothing but a mouthful, yet I saw it. Their eyes changed. Fear cracked, if only for a heartbeat. It is a start." She closed the book with trembling fingers, knowing Daniel had not yet felt the ripple, but when he did, it would not be hunger he feared, it would be mercy. Daniel sensed it before he could name it. At first, it was in the way the family moved. Their eyes no longer clung to him with the same desperate obedience. They lowered their gazes, yes, but not with the old terror. Something had shifted beneath the surface. He tested them, asked questions meant to trip the tongue, demanded tasks carried out with precision. They obeyed, but he could feel it. The weight of his presence didn't press as deeply as before. That night by the fire, he studied them in silence. The father's bruises had faded to yellow. The children whispered to one another when they thought no one was listening. The mother hummed softly, a tune that Mercy recognized as a lullaby. Daniel's jaw tightened. Later, he turned his eyes on Mercy. "Strange," he said, voice calm but edged. "Fear is like water. It seeps into every crack, and yet, some of it seems to be drying up." Mercy kept her face unreadable. She felt his gaze searching her for betrayal, peeling at her silence like layers of skin. She only answered, steady and quiet. "Perhaps fear doesn't last forever." Daniel leaned closer, his smile slow and sharp. "Then we'll have to remind them." Mercy's blood ran cold. She knew what that meant. Daniel wasn't losing control yet, but he could smell the weakness in his grip, and when he sensed weakness, he never left it unpunished. Her diary that night was stark. The ripple has reached him. He doesn't know the cause, but he feels the tremor. "I've stolen crumbs of his power, and he will come hunting for the thief." The blow fell at dawn. Daniel woke the camp with a kick of his boot against the father's ribs. The man groaned, scrambling upright, but Daniel was already dragging him to the center of the clearing. The family screamed, the children clutching their mother's skirts. "You've grown comfortable," Daniel said, his voice calm as ever. "Too comfortable." He tossed the pouch, the same cursed pouch, into the dirt. "If fear has dulled, then it must be sharpened." The father begged, swore his loyalty, but Daniel ignored him. He drew the knife, its edge catching the first grey light of morning. Mercy's breath froze. She knew what was happening. Daniel wasn't punishing a crime. He was staging a lesson. He would carve fear back into them, and in doing so, remind everyone that mercy was his to grant or deny. The children wailed. The mother dropped to her knees, pleading. Daniel raised the knife, and Mercy moved. "Wait," she said, stepping forward before she could think better of it. Her voice cracked, but the words carried. "It wasn't him." The camp fell silent. Even the birds seemed to still. Daniel turned, his expression unreadable, eyes locking on her. "Go on," he said softly. Mercy's heart pounded like a drum. She had no proof, no plan, only the raw instinct that if she stayed silent, blood would be spilled and the chain of terror would thicken. So she chose the only weapon she had, her voice. "It was another traveler," she lied, steady now, "one who passed through at night. I saw him. He left that pouch." Daniel studied her, his gaze long and heavy, as if peeling her apart. Then slowly he lowered the knife. The father collapsed in the dirt, weeping. Daniel slipped the blade back into its sheath, his smile faint and terrible. "Interesting," he murmured. "Always watching, aren't you, Mercy? Always seeing what others miss." He walked away, leaving the family alive, but broken, and Mercy trembling in the aftermath. That night her diary read, "I stepped into the fire. I lied not to protect myself, but them. He knows I am not afraid to cross him, and that knowledge will be the most dangerous weapon of all." From that day forward, Daniel's eyes rarely left her. He still commanded, still rationed, still spoke with the same measured tone, but now Mercy felt the difference. His words bent toward her, his pauses hung heavier when she answered, and every silence became a test. He gave her tasks no one else received, fetching water alone in the dark, keeping count of supplies twice over, writing in her diary under his gaze. Each command was a probe, as if he were pressing the walls of her mind to see where they might give. One evening, when the others slept, Daniel sat across from her by the fire. The flames lit his face in sharp planes, his eyes catching the glow like a predator at the edge of the woods. "You lie well," he said, not as an accusation, as a fact. Mercy kept her pen moving, though her hand shook. "I write what I see." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "And what you see becomes truth, doesn't it?" Mercy's pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Truth belongs to those who remember." For the first time, Daniel laughed, not cruelly, not coldly, but with something that unsettled her even more. Admiration. "You're clever, Mercy," he said, "but cleverness is a blade, useful when it cuts for me, dangerous when it cuts against me." Then he rose and left her with the fire, but the weight of his words lingered long after the night grew quiet. Her diary entry was brief, almost carved into the page. "I am no longer his tool, I am his threat, and threats do not live long unless they strike first." The breaking point came beneath a moonless sky. Daniel had ordered them all awake in the dead of night. He stood at the edge of the camp, knife in hand, his shadow long in the firelight. The family huddled together, silent and pale. Mercy felt it in her chest. Tonight was not another lesson. Tonight was judgment. He paced before them slowly, like a preacher before his flock. "I've been patient," he said, voice steady. "But patience frays. Someone among us hides truth. Someone thinks they can shape the story against me." His gaze slid over the family, but lingered on Mercy. The knife glinted. "Tonight, the lie ends." The mother sobbed. The children shook. The father whispered a prayer. Mercy knew then that if she stayed silent, blood would run before dawn, and this time no lie could stop him. Her hands trembled, but her voice cut through the dark. "It's not them, it's me." The words seemed to split the night itself. The family gasped. Daniel froze, then smiled slowly, the way a wolf bares its teeth. "At last," he said, stepping closer, knife lowering to his side. "The truth." Mercy's pulse roared in her ears. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to fall back, to beg to survive, but she did not flinch. She met his eyes and spoke with a steadiness she didn't know she possessed. "You think fear makes you untouchable, but fear rots, it slips, and one day the same fear you carve into others will carve into you." The fire snapped. For the first time, Daniel's smile faltered. He leaned close enough that Mercy could feel his breath. "Careful," he whispered. "Blades that cut both ways draw blood fastest from the hand that wields them." But when he stepped back, he did not strike her. He only watched, knife in hand, eyes narrowed with something between fury and fascination. That night, Mercy's diary shook in her hands as she wrote, "I showed him, I will not break. He knows now that if he means to kill me, he must do it openly. The war between us is no longer hidden, it has begun." The fire burned low. The family slept fitfully, and Mercy, wide awake, stared at Daniel's shadow across the camp. One of them would not leave this place alive.